And I asked, where are all the people of color? Where's the diversity? And they've done an amazing job doing that in the last few years. And I am honored to be here with you today. So bonjour, standing alone, Indigenous, Gwingwa, Age, and Dotem. Hello. Standing alone is my spirit name, and I am from the Wolverine clan. I have been adopted by Ojibwe elder Cindy Crow, and we are honored to have her with us here today. My English name is Shauna Rae. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a white, cisgender, heterosexual woman with all the privilege that affords me. I'm currently living in southwestern Ontario near Dorchester, which is on the traditional land of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Adirondack, and the Lenni Lenape people. Some use the land where we live by Deshkan-Zibe, or the Thames River, as traditional beaver hunting ground. I am grateful to Creator, Grandfather Sun, Grandmother Moon, Mother Earth, for the opportunity for love and connection today. And to the spirits of the elders, the spirit guides, the ancestors, and the medicine people who I believe still walk the earth. I have Celtic roots, Irish, and a tiny bit of Swedish on my mom's side and Scottish on my dad's. I have racism and colonialism in my DNA, but I am committed to deepening understanding of the TRC's call to action and reframing responsibilities to land and community. I've claimed my privilege and the intergenerational framework I come from in my introduction because I've worked with a number of groups of post-secondary students, specifically from marginalized communities. And they told me that claiming privilege, creating a vulnerable, safe space, and a genuine commitment to being accountable helps create a feeling of belonging and an understanding from my part. And so I tried to begin meetings and presentations in this way. I also want to say that I do not have all the answers. I am consistently learning, and I'm not going to hand you a laundry list of things that you can do. What I am going to do is pose questions. Some I have answers for, but hopefully you will have input too. This is a discussion, a circle, if you will, where we can all contribute. Miigwech to all of you for coming today. Howard R. Johnson is one of my favorite human beings. I never had the chance to meet him while he was alive, but I feel a closeness to his spirit and his soul. He died 2 years ago, February 9th, 2022, of lung cancer. He was 68. Harold R. Johnson was an Indigenous elder, a knowledge keeper, a logger, a trapper, a crown prosecutor, a celebrated author, and of course, a storyteller. He was an incredibly wise and inspirational man, and his legacy of story and storytelling remains. During one of his last audio interviews with CBC's Sheila Rogers, Harold talked about the visit. And I'd like us all to remember this today as we engage with one another and beyond. It is a very powerful explanation of how we can visit with one another. And I think it's an important message. I just want to make sure that I have the audio on. So that you can hear it. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Time.
Can you hear that? Did you hear that little bit? Okay, good.
Yeah.
No agenda. Love. There should be some food. Tea and coffee, water if that's all you have. And time. And just accepting each other as human beings. And patience. And storytelling. And storytelling and learning to listen to stories. If you learn how to listen with your heart. So imagine where your heart is physically within your body on the left side of your chest until you're aware of it, till you can feel it. And then just let it go. And when you do that, practice listening with your heart, your brain does something. It stops thinking of the answer while the person is speaking. And you can just listen. And when you can really listen, then you can hear. And after you've practiced this for a long time, you learn how to speak from the heart. And it's the same ritual. You imagine where your heart is, and don't worry about the words that are going to come out, because they're going to come out from the heart. And that's how you visit.
So let's have a visit. I will be speaking from my heart and also listening to you all from my heart. And if you can listen, speak, and interact from your heart today, I think we'll all learn a lot from one another. Harold R. Johnson wrote fiction and nonfiction. He wrote about alcohol, about love, about forgiveness, and all of it wrapped up in story. He said we needed a new story. He also said we needed to live like family. He told the story of when the settlers came and the indigenous folks that were already here adopted them into their family. And we attempted to annihilate them and rob them of their culture. We definitely need a new story. So let's start at the beginning. And this is where you contribute. What is story? What do you think story is? What does story mean to you? What is a general definition of story? How do stories help us? Story helps us explain what we don't understand, too, I think. I think who gets to tell stories? I think that it's who's listening to stories. How do we exchange stories? I think anyone can tell a story and anyone can share stories. We hear them all the time in coffee shops, hockey arenas, school cafeterias, or lunchrooms. But can anyone tell someone else's story? Who gets to do that? I think when we take on the honor and responsibility of telling someone else's story, we need to pause and think about how we are in that story with them. How will our telling of that story affect them? What does it mean to their community? How will it land? And we have Mr. Johnson again. This is at a keynote speech he gave at the University of Saskatchewan. He talked about the story that's been told about Indigenous folks in so-called Canada. This is really powerful. And I'm just going to say that I'm going to get choked up likely a lot, or some, maybe. Danny, oh, no thanks. Okay. It is an incredible story.
The story that I want to talk about, the story that brings us here, is that lazy, dirty, drunken Indian story. They've been telling it about us since first contact. Told it throughout the colonial period,
We were told that story during residential school era, and we're still being told that story in the media today. They've toned it down a little bit, but they still keep telling that story. It's a nocebo story. Placebo and nocebo don't just apply to sugar pills, they apply to every story that's ever told. Every story that's ever told can heal you or kill you. And that lazy, dirty, drunken Indian story is killing us. We've taken it into ourselves and we believe it. We believe it because we've been told it too long. I had a young boy on the reserve in northern Saskatchewan tell me that to be a real Indian, you have to drink. I see people in court. I was a Crown prosecutor for 8 years. People with long criminal records, lots of violence. Who did they beat up? Other Indians. Why do Indian men beat up on their women? Because they're squaws. We've taken this story into ourselves so much and believed it and act upon it that we're destroying ourselves because we're beginning to hate ourselves because of the story that's told about us. And the story isn't true. 35% of Aboriginal people in Canada do not drink at all, compared to 18% of Canadians. Twice as many of us are completely sober than the regular Canadian. But that's the story that's being told. What I'm hoping to do is create a conversation and get people talking and bring this out. We don't want to talk about it. White people can't say Indians and alcohol in the same sentence because somebody's going to point at them and call them racist. And Indians don't want to talk about it because we're scared somebody's going to point at us and say, see, it's true. They are lazy, dirty, drunken Indians.
Harold talked about truth. I just want to pause, actually. That's such a powerful speech. I get choked up when I watch it. So Harold talked about truth and that the dirty, drunken Indian story wasn't true. I'm curious if you think there is one indisputable truth. Is there one entity that has the handle on the truth? Maybe journalists, maybe the news, maybe clerics. Does anyone have the handle on the truth? How do we determine the truth? Do we all have our own truth? Feel free to comment in the in the chat or come off mic if you feel you have what you think about truth. Please don't be shy. I will move on if you don't. I believe that our truth stems from what we believe in our heart, what we take in, like Harold said. But it's also tapping into your own knowing, your own intuition. Here's an example. A friend engaged with an individual from another country who is doing spiritual work with a charity that works with children, orphans. She asked me to check into the organization. What I found wasn't favorable. But is that important? Is everything we find on the internet true? How do we determine what is true? I believe we have to ask ourselves, what do we believe the truth to be about ourselves? And what do we believe the truth to be about others? There's a ton of stuff online. It's how groups have been able to spread disinformation and untruths. And we absorb those stories, the more we dwell in them. We're at a critical time in determining what truth is. I'm going to put a pin in that for a second. We'll come back. We'll come back to truth. Privilege also plays a huge part in the lens and comfort through which we see and experience the world. My family grew up relatively poor. That doesn't negate the fact that I am white, and that allows me a free pass in most spaces. I self-identify as heterosexual, which is another layer of privilege. I'm cisgender, which means I identify with the gender I was born with, another layer. I went to college. Although I struggled to pay for it, I still had the privilege of post-secondary education. Here's a visual of what power and privilege looks like. You may or may not have seen a variation of this before. The purpose of me showing you this is not to debate its validity. The question I'm asking is, how do we equalize and or shift power through stories? I'm going to check in on the chat for a second because I can't see them all without looking. So I'm going to go and take a look here. Feel free to drop anything into the chat. Come off mic if you like. Can't seem to get to it. There we go. All right. Yeah, so Sylvia Duckworth created this visual, but there are lots of other ones. And there's lots of, at those links, there's a bunch of resources that you can find. Do you find yourself on there? Do you see where you land? You'll notice that I didn't share my titles, credentials, schooling, projects I've worked on, people I've interviewed. Being vulnerable and authentic removes hierarchy, I believe. And it shows you don't subscribe to a capitalist ideal of attempting to be a perfect human, that you're willing to get things awkward and wrong, and that you're willing to lean into discomfort. This video is at the end of a powerful speech by New Zealand's Member of Parliament, 21-year-old Hana Rawiti Mapi Clark. She is New Zealand's youngest MP in 170 years. She celebrates Indigenous people in her first speech by performing the traditional haka, or war cry. Mapi Clark has always been fighting for the rights of New Zealand's Indigenous communities. I want you to pay close attention to the other folks in Parliament watching her, and then I'm going to ask for your comments.
I call Hannah Rafiti Maipi Clark to make her maiden statement.
Tēnā rā koe e te pika, tēnā rā tātou e te whare. Ka ngau ki mō kau, ka ngau ki tamaki, ka ru te whenua, ka mate te marama, ka taka ngā whetū i te rangi, ka ara wai kato i te rua, au e ha,
I get choked up when I watch that too. There is so much power in embodying who you truly are. And she was living her authentic self. And if you felt something, which I think a lot of you do, I see in the chat that you did, that's because you remember what being authentic feels like. We all remember who we're supposed to be. And many people have the courage to stand up and be who they really are, embody their culture, their spirit, their passion. She claimed her place. But did you see how uncomfortable some of the MPs were? Some joined, some sang along, but some folks were uncomfortable. It couldn't have been easy to experience that if you've never seen something like that before in front of you. And there are tons of rules, a ton of rules in Parliament. Think about churches. Catholic Church, maybe. I grew up in a Catholic church. That's how I can quantify that, I would say. There are tons of rules, but not a lot of room for uniqueness. You can't bring your authentic self to an empire that is steeped in tradition that doesn't typically accept individuality. People showing up as their authentic selves. And in most cases, these empires don't accept diversity. And that's a fact. So, in the spirit of getting uncomfortable, we're going to try something different. And I'm hoping you all can lean into the discomfort you may feel. Everyone has a rich history, likely some positive and some negative. Without talking about where you work, your title, your education, or any other professional markers you may feel define you, we're going to split into groups and you're going to introduce yourself in a small group. This is, unless, of course, in a rare case, who you are is your chosen vocation, that you identify as the person who you are. And oh, how beautiful that would be and is. All of us have to fit into a job and a place. And how do we find our place in a society that merits specific things? And then who has access to those specific things? I'm curious if folks realized how it feels, maybe, for some folks who haven't achieved what society would deem as a success or some kind of professional leadership.
We have a few answers in the chat.
Oh, okay, cool. Thank you. Yes, thank you for that. I wasn't watching it. At a loss for other descriptors at first blush, I realized that beyond work or class, I don't really know what to say and have to share a little vulnerable. I found it freeing. Oh, lovely. Happy for that. That's great. I did this with my husband, who holds a position in an organization where he's a manager. And he said, it's interesting that is my identity, especially as a man. My whole professional life is my identity. And he's a white male. And he said that. He said, I'm at the top of the chain. And so this is how I define who I am in a society that puts me at the top. So in many cases, who I am, what education I have, the positions I may have had, make folks think I might be trustworthy. I was a radio journalist for nearly a decade in Southwestern Ontario. I was a reporter, a newscaster, a call-in talk show host, a columnist, and now a podcaster and a writer. So yeah, I have all these monikers, but should that make me credible? Should that make me believable? I can tell you, looking back on the stories I had the honor of sharing, some of them I stole the story from folks instead of sharing their stories. Regrettably, I came from a white lens of thinking that I had the right to the truth. But whose truth? My truth? My perception of the truth? My colonial lens of truth? We're back to truth. What impacts might this have caused the people that I was interviewing? It was only when I started a podcast, at first amplifying women identifying non-binary and queer entrepreneurs in rural Canada, that I truly started to recognize my whiteness and the comfort it afforded me and the lens through which I naively saw the world. Someone else sent me an email about Stella Sane, a Black woman beekeeper and soap maker, juggling a home with her family in Alberta and a farm in Porcupine Plain, Saskatchewan. When I asked Stella to be a guest, she wanted to speak with me on the phone first. Who does that anymore? And the words that tumbled out of my mouth were, how can I support you? How can I support you with this podcast? She said that those simple words told her that I was an ally. And if I wasn't totally aware, which I wasn't, I was at least working on it. She had a lot of grace with me. I have been uncomfortable often and messed up countless times where I felt very embarrassed, awkward, vulnerable. But when I could finally see the disparity, I could not unsee it. I'm probably going to get choked up when I play this one too.
So just for one moment, just picture your house burning down with people you love, and other people are just watching it. They're watching it. All I want, all anyone that is experiencing pain and distress wants, is for you to acknowledge that you can see it. I know everyone doesn't have the answers. I don't have the answers, although we're going to touch on what I'm doing as a person to acknowledge this, how you can help, how you can change things. We are going to address that. But right now, the biggest thing is just addressing that you see it, that it's real, validating people that you can see our house is on fire and it's burning down.
That line chokes me up every time. Stella talked about being punched in the face by skinheads as a young Black teenager, how she navigates and code switches around white women like me. And she and I became close friends. She calls me in such a gracious way. I am forever grateful. But the discrimination is still happening. Only a month ago, Stella was yelled at and called "you people" when there was a misunderstanding at a venue she was teaching at. She literally had to have the white women there move in front of her to protect her. I've also witnessed white women respond to me first for Stella, simply because I'm white and they're more comfortable responding to me. My Indigenous mentor and colleague, Elder Cindy, I've witnessed white women speaking directly to me in meetings and dismissing her, even though Cindy is the lead business owner and project lead. I witnessed this consistently. And witnessing, bearing witness is important. Acknowledging to the marginalized person that you can see it. That's what Stella was talking about. Gratitude is really important. Stella doesn't owe me anything. Cindy doesn't owe me anything. In fact, I might have only been interested in speaking with Stella, exploiting her during Black History Month, which we're still in today. For instance, when I messaged her, I could have been tokenizing her. No one has to share time with you, nor do they have to share their story with you. It's about being in a relationship that is reciprocal, coming from a place of service radically changes the relationship. How can I support you? How does this information land with you? How can I advance your power, shift your power, share power with you? How can I stand with you, beside you? Harold R. Johnson talked about the visit, listening and speaking from the heart. Relationship building, for instance, with Indigenous people includes two important elements, and this came from Cindy Crow. Food and humor. They are common denominators. Have a meal and or refreshments so folks can talk like humans, one-to-one. Come with a playfulness and a curiosity and an openness to hear things, hold space for things, suspending any judgments or making suggestions, just sitting and listening with your heart. How can we tell or relate stories of cultures and people whose experiences we haven't had? How can we make decisions without involving the people they affect? We do this all the time. I don't feel that I can share a perspective now unless I've checked in, but I didn't always think that way. I thought everyone wanted media attention, of course, for instance, and that the way that I delivered the story, it was understood that I could be trusted. Nothing could be farther from the truth. Think about the ways Indigenous and Black folks are portrayed in the media. How about folks with disabilities? Any people of color, members of the 2S LGBTQAI+ community. International Women's Day is coming up. I was asked to moderate two panels of women. One would be entrepreneurs, the other women in political leadership in our county. When I saw the folks, the white male organizer of the International Women's Day event there were no women of color. And at first I said no. He said they were going for a different version of diversity. One woman was a newcomer. One woman was a young, new entrepreneur, and another woman with a disability. No women of color. I also suggested the event should have Indigenous representation, perhaps a song or prayer, and maybe he could ask a First Nation band council member or chief to be part of the leadership panel, since we have 3 First Nations communities in our county. He declined. In the meantime, I reached out to 4 women of color entrepreneurs I knew within our county who had never been asked to be on a panel. Each one had a different perspective. At first, I asked how I could stand up for them, but I changed that to how can I stand with you? I still get it wrong. This was only a couple of weeks ago. I ended up turning down the event. But what really mattered were the rich conversations I had with those women of color, vulnerably asking, how could I support and stand with them? Each of them had a different perspective. Each of them none of them wanted to tell me to take it or not. But I ended up with a lunch date and some new friends. And now I don't have anywhere to go for International Women's Day. So if you have some suggestions, I'm all for it. How can we change the way that we show up in storytelling or even in the way that we receive information? Can we open to receiving guidance from an older generation, a younger generation? Can we remove assumptions? Can we learn new ways of relating to others? I believe we all hold trauma from our ancestors, and often the way we were raised, our conditioning, told us to be perfect and fit into a certain dynamic, a certain societal standard. Maybe our parents thought it would make our lives easier. But this has actually paralyzed us from being vulnerable and showing up as we truly are, our authentic selves. Indigenous people knew all along this open dialogue, being real, removing masks, finding common ground was the way to unity. Why do you think colonizers wanted to obliterate Indigenous people with genocide? Two-eyed seeing was supposed to be Indigenous ways working with modern ways, both working together alongside each other. We white folks have tried to wipe out Indigenous folks, and yet some, like Harold R. Johnson and Elder Cindy Crow, are still willing to forgive and teach us and love us. They held out hope. My life is forever changed since I have received so much through Cindy's sacred circles. Sophia's going to put a link in the chat in how you can connect with Cindy and her circles. I have healed. I have received so much healing. I have received so much unconditional support. I am a different person. Black women like Stella still work with people like me. She had empathy and forgiveness in her heart because she still holds out hope too. We have so much to learn from each other in becoming like family. And that's what Harold R. Johnson wanted. And in creating that new story of the times we are living in right now, one that includes everyone and doesn't leave anyone out, like Harold described. We have so much to learn from each other in becoming like family. And in creating that new story. The advice I am called to impart is only this: be vulnerable and be brave. It's how we will all heal. And I'm going to leave it there and open it up to talk.